Hello engineers, welcome to the Troll Cave. Previously on this channel we went over how to make guided missiles using the Rdav missile script to help you in your PvE or PvP adventures. We're not going to go into detail on how to do that since we talked about that before, but today we're going to talk about how to make those missiles a little bit more effective. Just as a quick reminder, the missiles do require a merge block, a thruster of any kind, a battery for power, any kind of power source, and a gyroscope. That's all you need on board the missile. Then you need a programmable block and some kind of guidance on the ship that we're firing from. Here they're linked together by armor blocks, but that's not necessary. You can actually just put them together like this with the bare minimum. Obviously the hydrogen variety does require hydrogen of some kind, either a tank or a generator. But these missiles, just using the bare minimum, are not particularly effective. The way that we showed you how to make them in the original video, not great. It may have looked fine, but it's got a few weaknesses, and rather than explain it, let me show you. So I'm just going to drop this missile over here onto our launcher platform. I'm going to drop one of each. This is just there's no warhead on this, there's no anything here that's meant to do particularly high damage. I'm going to fire it at a red ship, just your basic red ship, and we'll see what the effects are. It should do pretty good against the red ship. We're going to turn on our guidance and fire the first missile. Somewhat decent damage. You might look at this and say, that's pretty good, but it could be a lot better. And this ship is all light armor. You'll see where the real problem kicks in once we fire it at something a little bit more durable. Let's go ahead and bring over our second target, which is just going to be a wall of heavy armor. It's got 5 layers. Obviously we don't expect to go through all of them, but it's just meant to measure penetration. So let's see how this basic missile does. Spoiler alert, it does not do very well. Dink! Barely any damage at all. Sure, it did a little bit of damage to the front layer, but we can do a lot better than that. Let me show you how. So if we jump right over here into the second section, we have some missiles that are actually competitively viable. Atmospheric missile that's okay. Hydro missile that you can actually reload with a connector, and another version of the ion missile. Now the main ordnance on all of these is a warhead. You'll notice the small turret on here as well, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Not going to use that just yet, but I want to show you the difference just by adding a warhead to the missile. Okay, so we're not going to be using these turrets here. I'm going to remove them. It's worth pointing out that on the default Rdav script, the warheads will not go off reliably. You might have to set the fuse. I recommend setting the fuse distance to 40 instead of 20 like it is by default.
No energy.
But that's another story. We'll get to little details like that a little bit later. Let's start off using the same example we did before. Red ship first. On the red ship, we're going to see a little bit more damage. Well, quite a bit more damage. So the warhead just does more damage than on a missile without one when you have the proper fuse set. With the default Rdav script, most of the time the missile's just going to smash into here and not detonate properly. properly. Something that most people don't know is that warheads that detonate on impact don't do anywhere near as much damage or have as large a blast radius as warheads that detonate manually, which the script is intended to do. But that's not actually what we're here to look at. This still isn't particularly impressive as missiles go because it is all light armor. Let's look at something a little bit more relevant, and that is the heavy target. Generally speaking, you're not going to need PMWs to attack light targets anyway. So testing against light targets isn't really all that valid a test. So let's set that heavy target back up and see what a difference this makes. Remember last time when we shot the heavy armor with no warhead, it did basically no damage. Huge difference here. If you've done testing with your missiles and you've had really inconsistent tests, it's because your warhead was probably not detonating before it hit. It was getting smashed by the impact of the missile and not detonating properly. The distance fuse is the really important part for why this works. But you can see the huge difference here. Lots of damage, went through 2 layers of heavy armor, and did some damage to a 3rd one. And that's just because of the warhead, whereas it basically did no damage to the front layer of armor before. So if you're going against moderately heavy targets, like they've got 1 layer of heavy armor, a warhead might be the way to go. But that does rely on the warhead staying intact, armed, the missile staying powered, everything working all the way up to the point of impact. And against a target that actually has turrets on it, that's not particularly likely. And that is where this comes into play. Blast doors are an alternative to warheads. They not only have better penetration, but even if your missile loses its thruster, loses battery, loses steering, loses something on the way to the target, all that it really needs is a little bit of weight behind these blast doors to go and do almost as much damage as a warhead. It's not going to do as much damage in a large area, but it's still going to penetrate deep and get those critical systems. This is what I would normally recommend using. Unless you've got some kind of a decoy system, unless you have some way of getting your warhead there intact reliably, which is something that we're going to talk about in a future video, I almost always recommend going for blast door missiles. You might wonder why I've got this set up here. We'll go into why I'm using this particular LED later on, but when your missile impacts, it's going to destroy the first block that it hits, and then it's going to damage 5 blocks behind it, and then it's going to count this as a separate collision. So every 6 blocks, the block plus 5 behind it is 1 collision. If these have low health, it's going to just completely delete these. They're not going to do any damage, and then this is going to be counted as a second collision. So this is basically hitting with 2 missiles, hitting with 2 objects. So let's go ahead and take a look at the difference that makes. Alright, so just like before, we've got the red ship first. Now, you'll see that we've got basically 2 impacts, like I was talking about before. The blocks in between those two blast doors basically make it like 2 missiles are hitting. You've got almost a full warhead's worth of damage right here with the main body hit, and then you've got a secondary hole that went all the way through this is what blast doors do. Blast doors penetrate deeper than any of the weapons in the vanilla game, including warheads, which is why we get the hole all the way through, like we're not seeing with the warhead. Especially against larger ships, this is going to penetrate hit those deep systems, whereas warheads are going to do lots of damage to the surface and do one side of the ship. They're not going to cripple it in one shot the way that warheads going all the way through the ship can do. But again, that's still a light armor test, which is nice, but like we said before, not particularly relevant. Let's try the heavy armor test. So remember, on the warhead, we got some places where we went through no heavy armor, some places where we went through one heavy armor block, and some places where we went through 2 full heavy armor blocks. Let's see what we can do with blast door tips. All the way through, and it's still going. So it won't make a particularly big hole. It won't look like it went all the way through, but you saw the blast door coming out the other side. It is a pinhole entrance. Sometimes you'll see the penetration all the way through, sometimes you'll see the holes, other times it will look like the block simply glitched through. Sometimes you'll see the batteries back here destroyed. But in every case, you will always damage some blocks behind the 5 layers of armor. In this case, we got a little bit of an unusual situation where it looks like it didn't actually damage the armor here. Normally you will see a hole where 1 layer of armor is missing completely all the way through. I should say 1 block of armor all the way through, something like this, but a little bit less clean. Yeah, actually, you can see that we've got damaged blocks back here. So if we had more of a ship behind this, you'd see some damage even behind these 5 layers of heavy armor, which is what missiles are really good at doing. So you can see we've got our 2 options here, basically. We've got our missiles that are really good at penetrating, blast doors, and then we've got our missiles that just have good overall damage but lower penetration, warheads. These are reliable, but the warheads are just kind of fun. Another thing to look at, one thing that we skipped over before, were these the interior turrets on here. One of the biggest advantages of missiles over the vanilla weapons, especially in vanilla Space Engineers, is their range. We can shoot at targets that are much farther away than the 800 meters we're limited to on all of the vanilla weapons. But if you have the guidance turret on your ship, then you're limited to the range of that turret. So, to demonstrate what we're talking about here, let me put a target way out there. We've got 2 kilometers away. Let's come back here, use a missile. Let's take this guy right here. You'll notice that the thruster is off. There is a little bit of hydrogen in that tank. I always have my hydro thrusters off, just because there's no need to have them on. The script turns them on automatically anyway. Anyhow, since we lost our first guidance turret, we're going to have to recompile the script. That is the biggest disadvantage to putting the guidance turret on the missile itself, is that you've got to recompile the script every time before you fire. Perhaps there's some way to get around that. There isn't that I'm aware of, however. So when you first fire the missile, it'll fire in the general direction. I'm going to miss intentionally here just because, just to show off this feature. when you first fire, and there's no lock-on with this script, you'll fire in the general direction of your target. And then as soon as that turret locks on, if it still has any juice left, it may not have had enough. Yeah, we didn't have enough, did not fill that with enough hydrogen. I'm going to cut ahead real quick, and we're going to try that with the hydrogen missile. I mean, with the ion missile, because we didn't properly charge up that hydro missile. Okay, and we're back with the ion missile here. Hydrogen missiles are completely viable. We're going to talk about that a little bit later too. It's just that I messed up there and didn't put anything in there. It looks like I also actually forgot to turn on the interior turret on the previous missile. I'm going to go ahead and turn that on. And then again, we're going to have to recompile the programmable block to get this working correctly. Alright, so biggest disadvantage to the ion is they're less powerful, so they're bad at course correction, but that'll actually give you a chance to see the missile course correcting once it locks onto the target. Right now it's not locked onto the target because we're still out of turret range, but as soon as that turret starts firing, 800 meters here, 600, there we go, it sees the target. And pretty good hit. So that is basically the benefit to putting the turret on the missile itself. You get guidance, a guided weapon from a very long range. Gravity guns have the same effect, except that they're not guided. You can hypothetically hit a target from this distance with a gravity weapon, but without some kind of scripted assistance for aiming, it's pretty hard to actually make a shot at several kilometers out. Again, you can do that with anything. You can do it with any kind of missile. You can put a interior turret on the ends of these as well. Just set it to target what you want it to target. You can set it to target only large grids, then the missile will target only large grids, etc. It works just the same as if you had the turret on your ship. Only big disadvantage here is that you can't actually weld these missiles back up and fire them rapid fire, because after every shot you're going to lose your turret, and then you're going to have to recompile a script. Another big disadvantage is, since all of the turrets running on a single programmable block are going to be running on the same script, if you want to fire multiple missiles, you're actually going to need multiple programmable blocks, and you're going to have to put these in different name groups. So you'll see right here, all of the missiles that we have going have the default hashtag A hashtag marker on their naming. You'd have to mark them something else, say hashtag B hashtag, put them on a separate programmable block, set up the programmable block to fire. We're using that tag, but in exchange you get that super long range. So now you have all of the basic tools. You can choose which you want between the warheads or the penetrator type missiles. But you probably don't want to use any of these. You probably want to design your own missile. Maybe you want to go a little bit heavier, you want multiple thrusters. So let's take a look at our options. The biggest thing to take into account with missiles, you saw how long it took that ion missile to decelerate and course correct. The thrust to weight ratio of a missile is really important. So keeping the mass of a missile down will significantly help it to stay on course. Unfortunately, if we go over here and we look at the mass of all of the blocks that we use with missiles, we can't avoid using a couple of the heaviest components on there. In particular, the gyroscope. Gyroscope weighs almost 13 tons, and you absolutely need it. You can't steer your missile without a gyroscope. And using the Rdav script, it won't even fire without a gyroscope on board. So you can make up for that in one of two ways. One is to simply use a more powerful thruster type. If we take a look at the thrust values of the ion thruster, which is the weakest type of thruster, you can see the build info in the left-hand corner there. It's got a force of 345 kilonewtons versus the atmospheric small thruster, which has about twice that, 650 kilonewtons, and the small hydro thruster, which is the king of all the small thrusters here, with 1,000, making it almost 3 times as powerful as a single ion engine. Also worth noting, the ion engine itself is way heavier than anything else over here. Especially the hydrogen thrusters, it's the lightest of the bunch. When you put on a tank, since the tank itself weighs 3 tons, it weighs about the same. One hydro engine plus one hydro tank weighs about as much as either of the other thrusters, but you can run actually multiple thrusters off of a single tank, which, especially when you consider that this also has the most power of any thruster type, it's just the king of thrusters. Also worth noting, the large hydrogen thruster only weighs 7 tons. So one large hydrogen thruster is actually lighter than 2 ions or two atmospheric thrusters. Whereas the large varieties of those two types of thrusters are way, way, way heavier. We're talking 33 tons and 43 tons versus 7 tons. So if you're going to add multiple thrusters on there, consider using a large hydro, because it has the highest thrust of any thruster in the game, and it's extremely light. Plus, since it's going on a missile, you don't need a high capacity. You can use a small hydrogen tank on there. And this is basically the best thruster for missiles if you want to spend the time to load up hydrogen. Otherwise, you can consider how many thrusters can run on a single battery, because ideally we're going to want to keep these as cheap as possible, right? A single battery has a capacity of 12 megawatts. It can output 12 megawatts worth of power. That's enough to run, what is that, 5? Yeah, exactly 5 atmospheric thrusters, or a little over 3 ion thrusters, less than 4 ion thrusters. So if you're sticking to, that's actually why we've got 4 atmo thrusters on this missile right here, is because you can actually run all 4 atmo thrusters at full power on a single battery. And you're more than doubling your power to rate, your thrust to weight ratio by adding 2 thrusters, simply because of how massive the gyroscope is. All of the armor and everything else that we put on here, the warheads, the blast doors, all of that is chump change in terms of weight, in terms of mass, compared to the gyroscope, which we can't get rid of. So effective missiles are going to probably have either multiple small thrusters, 2 or 3 ions, up to 5 small atmos, as many hydros as you can fit on there because they don't actually use power, or a large hydrogen thruster. It's going to be your ideal setup. Granted, you do want to take into account, like if you use the smallest variety of missiles over here and just want to throw a warhead on something like this, this is a very small profile. They're cheap. You can spam these things out real quick. The smaller a missile is, the easier it is to auto-weld it. So you're just going to have to look at what your goals are with your missile. Or do you want to make sure that you're catching your target and make it faster? Or do you just want to make sure, are you certain that you're going to get your missile to your target? And you just want to make it as cheap as possible. Here is an example of a bit of a compromise between the two. We've got hydro on here. It's still really cheap because we're not using multiples of anything. But we can auto-weld and reload these things using the new hinge block. Pretty nifty. It's going to take a little while to reload, naturally, because of the same issue that we saw before with where we saw before with when we didn't actually have enough hydrogen in the tank on that missile, and we had to use the ion missile. It's because we didn't give it enough time to charge. So if we take a look in here, these are charging up relatively slowly. But the more O2 generators you have on here, the faster the missiles are going to charge. So you could set something up like this depending on what the limits are on your server, depending on how many missiles you want to charge up at a given time. This is a fairly valid setup. So I'm going to give these a couple seconds, and then we will be right back to show you how this ends up working. Alright, so we've given those missiles a chance to fill up. 25% should be good enough to get to the target. We have them set up here. I mentioned earlier that we can have multiple missiles with the targets on board, but we need to name them separately. So we've done that here. We have a set of #A and #B missiles. So we'll just go into our programmable blocks and set one of them to use the #B. That's all that you need to do. It is change the missile tag, and then because we've got new turrets, I'm going to go ahead and recompile both of these. They're both going to follow the same tow line, but they will track separately. So let's go ahead and get them into firing position. I'll fire one over there, and one over there. And you'll notice that they're accelerating much faster than the ion missiles were before, and that they will course correct much better than the ion missiles did, because they've got a 3 times better thrust to weight ratio, because they're hydrogen missiles. We did have a failure to detonate there. In that case, in this instance, the failure to detonate on the second missile came from the fact that it lost its target and had to retarget after the first missile destroyed it. That's just going to happen when you fire a lot of missiles, and is one of the additional benefits of using the blast doors instead of the warheads. Because the blast doors don't care if they don't have a target or not. They're still going to ram straight through the ship and will do plenty of damage even if they don't detonate. Whereas the warhead missiles, just like we saw with the very first missile that we fired with 0 ordnance, will just bink, bounce off the ship, bounce off of heavy armor in particular, if they aren't remote detonated. But which you use is still up to you, obviously. For that reason, I would actually, if you're going to fire one big missile, a bunch of decoys and one big missile, I would recommend using the warheads, whereas if you're just going to spam missiles out, which is usually the more effective strategy, use one by one missiles. After all, you can only fit so many missiles on your ship. I would recommend going with the blast doors. But we'll talk about that again in a later video. At any rate, one last thing to consider here is this missile, this big ole missile, looks really big and scary and expensive, but if we go ahead and we take a look at the mass of these missiles, let's look at something relatively simple like this guy right here. The mass gives you a good idea of the cost as well. So this has a mass of, say, here we go, 22,000. The total mass of that missile is 22,000. Now if we go for something a little bit heavier, like this right here, because it's got blast doors instead, it has a mass of 28,000. So that's a totally normal missile, right? 28,000. So what do you think this is, right? This looks a lot bigger. We've got a big old thruster in here, right? 44,000. this guy right here only weighs and thus costs about twice as much as this guy right here. Well, these two are about the same thing. And that, again, is because the gyroscopes on missiles are such a big part of their overall mass. At 13,000, that's over half the mass of these little missiles. And this guy can still turn just fine with one gyroscope. It's going to be a lot more durable. Because you can put the thrusters inside here, it's going to have a lot better course correction. You can fit much larger ordnance on here. You can easily put a 9x9x9, I should say 3x3x3 chunk of warheads on here, or a lot of blast doors. Or if you want to go a little bit fancy and use an explosives detonator, which can have a blast radius of about 1 kilometer, this is a very effective way of getting slightly more expensive ordnance to the target with way more thrust. Again, just to review, this has 7.2 meganewtons versus what a lot of people are using is these small ions, 345 kilonewtons. So don't want to do the math, what, 15 times more powerful? More than that. Than these guys right here. And only about twice the mass when you go for the total missile. So it's not quite as overkill as it looks. I'd recommend considering it when you do your designs. The biggest downside to a missile like this is that you're probably only going to carry one of them in a battle, and you're not going to weld it on the spot. If you're going to weld on the spot, go for a 1x1 missile like this that you can weld up with 2 welders. Otherwise, I would consider something like this. As for how you would use these different types of missiles, when you would use something big like this, when you would use something small like this, we'll go over the actual strategies for using missiles in combat in a future video. For now, I'd say play around with it a little bit and enjoy.